Rachel Sloane had always been a woman of precision and restraint. She didn't believe in wasting words or energy, and she certainly didn't believe in making herself a spectacle. After nearly 3 decades working behind locked doors in government buildings with no windows and very few names on the walls, she had retired to a quiet corner of the country that was just out of reach from anyone who might remember her for the wrong reasons or the right ones. The ranch she'd chosen wasn't grand by most standards. It wasn't the kind of place you'd see in magazines, but it had land, seclusion, and something even rarer: silence. Not the dead kind that made you uneasy, but the kind that soothed nerves long frayed by years of quiet wars no one ever talked about publicly. She moved in without fanfare, bringing only 2 German shepherds, a few crates of documents, an old military trunk with no labels, and a battered black Chevy Suburban that looked like it had survived a war zone because, in fact, it had. The house on the property was small: 2 bedrooms, steel-reinforced front doors, and window frames built for hurricane zones. She had it rewired and replumbed without hiring anyone local. Contractors came from 2 counties over, paid in cash, and left without asking questions. The only people who visited her in the first 3 months were 2 delivery men from a farm supply store and a quiet man with federal credentials who dropped off a heavy crate marked "Fragile" biological monitoring equipment. From the moment Rachel D. set foot on the property, she made one thing clear: she was not looking to be part of a community. She wasn't interested in block parties, newsletters, potlucks, or friendly chats over the fence. Her land was private, and so was her life. This did not go unnoticed. In the surrounding area, an expensive, sprawling semi-rural development nestled between hills and open range, people were used to knowing everything about everyone. The local committee, as they liked to call themselves, was unofficial in title but loud in presence. It was led by a woman named Karen Rawlings, a former real estate agent turned self-proclaimed neighborhood guardian, whose greatest joy in life appeared to be managing other people's behavior. Karen noticed Rachel almost immediately, but it wasn't until week 5 that she worked up the nerve to pay her a visit. It was a warm Thursday afternoon when she walked up the long gravel path, clipboard in hand, perfectly styled blonde hair unmoved by the breeze, and rang Rachel's doorbell twice. No one answered. The dogs barked behind the door, but Rachel remained silent inside. Karen left a note tucked into the screen door, something about ensuring neighborhood cohesion and collective safety. The next week, Karen returned, this time with another committee member in tow. Again, Rachel didn't answer. The dogs barked louder. That evening, Rachel installed a second camera above the door. Motion-triggered, high-resolution, and directly connected to a satellite backup. The following Sunday, Karen stood at the edge of Rachel's gate, her arms folded, watching as the Suburban rolled slowly up the drive. Rachel stepped out, didn't say a word, didn't offer a wave, didn't even look in Karen's direction. The woman called out, "We'd love to get to know you, Rachel. It's important we all look out for each other around here." Rachel closed the gate behind her, locked it, and walked inside. What Karen couldn't possibly know, and what Rachel would never say aloud, was that this wasn't rudeness or arrogance. It was safety. It was discipline. Rachel had built a life on understanding risk, and she'd learned long ago that letting the wrong people get too close could cost you everything. Privacy wasn't a preference. It was protocol. She hadn't faked her background to disappear into a small town just to have some nosy suburban tyrant decide she needed checking on. But as always, the quieter you are, the louder people want to know why. Within a month, Karen had rallied a handful of other residents who'd expressed concern. They had questions. Why did Rachel have reinforced fencing? Why were there warning signs in multiple languages around the edge of her pasture? Why was her backfield filled with massive, horned bulls that no one had seen delivered or sold? More troubling, why did local police cars sometimes stop by the edge of her land? Not with sirens, but quietly, as if checking in. The bulls were a breed few locals recognized. Massive, dark-coated, and distinctly marked, They stood calmly behind the electric fences, unmoving except for their eyes, which followed people like sentinels. Rachel never explained where they came from. But the truth, if anyone had bothered to check the Federal Livestock Registry, was that they were part of a protected program. Their genetic line had been traced back through multiple generations to a breed so rare it had been declared part of a national agricultural preservation initiative. Rachel had received them not because she was a rancher, but because she had once authored the regulation that protected them. Still, the committee didn't know that, and they didn't care. All they saw was a woman who didn't participate, didn't respond to friendly outreach, and clearly thought herself above the rules. Karen, frustrated by Rachel's silent dismissal, decided to act. If Rachel wouldn't open her door, perhaps it was time to question what she was hiding. So she called the sheriff's department. The report she filed was vague but suggestive. Suspicious behavior, potential animal mistreatment, possible unregistered land use. She mentioned Rachel's refusal to communicate, her aggressive dogs, and her strange visitors at odd hours. She ended with the phrase, "We're not trying to cause trouble, but in these times, you just never know." When the sheriff's deputy arrived that afternoon, Rachel was on her porch sipping black coffee and reviewing a land survey document. The officer, Deputy Thomas Bain, approached slowly, respectfully. Rachel looked up, her face calm but unreadable. She didn't ask why he was there. She didn't need to. They spoke for 3 minutes. He asked if everything was all right. She said it was. He asked if she had any dangerous animals on the property. She raised an eyebrow and gestured to the bulls who stood behind the fence like statues. Then she pulled out a folder, handed him a laminated sheet marked with an official USDA seal and a list of protective codes. He read it, paused, looked at her again, more carefully this time. Then he nodded and walked back down the path. At the gate, Karen was waiting with crossed arms and a smirk that vanished the second Deputy Bain looked at her. "Everything all right?" she asked, too casually. He hesitated, then said evenly, "Ma'am, she's our boss. Maybe not on the badge, but close enough." Karen blinked. "Excuse me?" Deputy Bain climbed into his cruiser without another word. He didn't turn on the siren. He didn't file a report. But when he drove away, Karen was still standing at the gate, confusion and indignation mixing into one bitter, unresolved taste in her mouth. Rachel watched from the porch, not smiling, not gloating, just observing. She had no interest in dominance games, but she knew now that the game had started, and she also knew something Karen hadn't figured out yet. There were rules in this world. Some you could bend, some you could break, and some were written by people like Rachel Sloane, for moments just like this. Rachel Sloane had learned long ago that silence had weight. Sometimes it was a shield, other times a provocation. In the days following Deputy Bain's quiet departure from her property, silence became a battlefield. Rachel returned to her routines without interruption. She tended to the bulls at dawn, checked the perimeter fences at midday, monitored the water filtration systems in the late afternoon, and reviewed reports and satellite data late into the night. Her days were regimented but never idle. Every action was deliberate. She was not a woman who wasted time, and certainly not a woman who underestimated threats, especially ones that came wrapped in gossip, ignorance, and entitlement. But for Karen Rawlings, the silence was unbearable. It gnawed at her in ways she couldn't articulate. Rachel's calm refusal to respond, explain, or even acknowledge her efforts felt like an insult that reached deeper than any argument could have. She replayed the deputy's words in her head. "She's our boss." Over and over, and the more she thought about them, the more they twisted into something intolerable. How dare that woman act untouchable? Who was she to operate above the rules, above the neighborhood, above people like Karen who had spent years building a sense of order in their community. The more Karen stewed, the more convinced she became that Rachel's presence wasn't just disruptive, it was dangerous. And so, the next escalation came not with a bang, but with the subtlety of a landmine. 3 mornings after the police visit, Rachel awoke to find tire tracks leading from the county road straight up to her southern pasture gate. That gate was supposed to be locked. She checked the chains, still intact, but the padlock had been cut and replaced with a different one. A fresh set of boot prints dotted the dirt just beyond the gate, leading directly toward the bull's enclosure. Rachel didn't call anyone. She didn't panic. She walked the full perimeter of the pasture, noting every footprint, every blade of grass disturbed, every subtle shift in terrain that suggested intrusion. Her bulls were calm but alert. One had a small scrape on his side, not deep but fresh. A warning. Rachel returned to the house and reviewed the footage from the night before. Just after 2:40 a.m., 3 figures had entered the property through the south gate. They moved with purpose, not stumbling or unsure, but with a practiced coordination that triggered an immediate knot in her stomach. They were carrying long rifles. One had a radio clipped to his vest. Another wore a cap with the logo of a local hunting outfitter. The camera captured their faces, partially obscured but clear enough for software to enhance. One man even paused to urinate by the fence, glancing around like a teenager caught sneaking out, unaware he was being recorded in full HD. Rachel downloaded the files to an encrypted drive, uploaded a backup to an off-site server, and made a single phone call. It wasn't to the sheriff. It was to a contact listed in her old Rolodex under a name that had long since vanished from any public records. The conversation was brief, clinical. 3 unauthorized males entered a federal livestock preservation site at 0240 hours. Video and stills attached. Physical contact with protected animals confirmed. Gate tampering present. Recommend immediate federal response. The voice on the other end confirmed receipt, asked no questions, and ended the call with 2 words. "We'll move." By noon, 2 unmarked black vehicles rolled up the access road. 4 agents, badges displayed but names unrevealed, moved methodically around the property, collecting evidence, measuring boot prints, and retrieving the cut padlock. Rachel said little. She handed them the footage, pointed out the physical damage, and waited. One of the agents, a lean woman with dark eyes and a clipped tone, nodded as she reviewed the footage. "These men have records," she said quietly. "One's already on probation. This qualifies as a federal violation of conservation statutes. We'll have them within 72 hours. Rachel nodded once. She didn't thank them. She didn't smile. It wasn't personal. It was just protocol. But the incident wasn't over. That night, as the wind rose and a dry storm loomed on the horizon, Rachel noticed a vehicle parked just beyond the tree line across the road from her property. It didn't move. No headlights. No license plate visible from her side. She noted the make, Chevy Silverado, dark blue, aftermarket tires, and made a mental note. The next morning, it was gone, but the tracks remained. At noon, a package arrived at her gate. No return address. Inside was a printed letter, unsigned. The words were typed, clinical and threatening. "This is ranch land, not a sanctuary. You don't belong here. These bulls belong on someone's plate, not in a glass cage. You keep pushing and things will get ugly. You've been warned." Rachel stared at the letter for a full minute. Then she fed it through her shredder piece by piece without changing expression. That evening, she reinforced the south gate with a reinforced steel crossbar and motion-triggered perimeter alarms. She didn't call anyone, didn't post warnings, didn't record a statement. She simply responded with action, the only language she trusted. The bulls were moved temporarily to the smaller paddock closer to the house, where they could be monitored more closely. Rachel began wearing her sidearm openly, something she had never needed before in this quiet valley, but now felt necessary. 3 days later, the arrests were made. 2 of the men were picked up at a gas station outside of town. The third tried to run and was tackled in the woods behind his cousin's property. News didn't travel far. No articles, no press. It was a federal matter, handled quietly. But in a small town, rumors didn't need headlines. People started whispering. They said Rachel had friends in high places. They said she was ex-military, maybe CIA, maybe even deeper. They said the bulls were government experiments. They said she was a threat. And Karen? She doubled down. After the arrests, she called an emergency meeting of the Neighborhood Oversight Committee. 4 retirees, 1 stay-at-home father, and a local business owner with more opinions than sense. They gathered in her living room, sipping lemon water and exchanging concerned glances as Karen spoke in increasingly frantic tones about community safety, unauthorized livestock, and rogue federal agents intimidating residents. She presented them with printed photos, stills from her own drone, which she had flown illegally over Rachel's property the previous week. She showed zoomed-in shots of the bulls, the security cameras, and even Rachel herself, sitting on her porch with a rifle beside her. It was supposed to be damning, but to anyone with common sense it just looked like a woman protecting her land. Still, Karen demanded action. She proposed a petition to have Rachel removed from the community for violating shared agricultural standards and creating a climate of fear. The room was divided. Some nodded uncomfortably. Others looked away. One finally spoke. "Karen, maybe it's not our place to decide who's dangerous, especially after what happened with those men." Karen's face tightened. She wasn't used to pushback, but she masked it with a smile and said, "We'll put it to a vote then." Outside, the wind picked up. Another storm rolled in, and Rachel, alone in her house, scanned the tree line with night vision binoculars, noting the glint of another hidden camera lens in the brush. This wasn't just neighborhood tension anymore. It was a coordinated pressure campaign, laced with rural hostility and old-fashioned fear of what people don't understand. But Rachel had dealt with worse, had outlasted foreign agents, political backstabbing, corporate sabotage, and personal betrayals that would break most people. What she saw now wasn't new. It was familiar. The first shot had been fired. The players had moved into position, and Rachel was just getting started. The days that followed brought a shift so subtle that only someone like Rachel Sloan could have detected it. A change in how the town breathed, how the roads seemed quieter when she drove them, how certain neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stared just a second too long, their gazes not of curiosity but of quiet calculation, as if trying to solve a riddle they never expected to encounter in their backyard. It was no longer just tension, it had evolved into strategy. And Rachel knew from long experience that when people feel powerless, they don't back off. They regroup, reframe, and return with more dangerous intentions dressed in the guise of civic concern. That shift became undeniable the morning a certified letter appeared in Rachel's mailbox, delivered not by the regular carrier but by a courier in an unmarked truck. The envelope bore the logo of the county assessor's office, but the language inside told a different story. The letter alleged multiple unregistered modifications to agricultural infrastructure on her property, citing zoning concerns, environmental violations, and improper containment protocols for livestock. It referenced anonymous complaints, photos submitted by third parties, and threatened formal inspections unless corrective actions were taken within 10 business days. Rachel read it once, then again more slowly, parsing the language with the care of someone trained to read the real meaning beneath bureaucratic fog. It wasn't a warning. It was a maneuver. the kind designed not to fix a problem but to provoke a reaction. She folded the letter, placed it in a file labeled External Pressure, and began documenting. Every step from that point on was logged. Calls made, emails sent, statements filed. She retained a specialized agricultural attorney based out of Austin, a man who had previously sued the state on behalf of endangered species and won. He reviewed the letter, noted the irregularities in jurisdiction, and filed a preemptive injunction against any unauthorized entry onto her land. It was a quiet but decisive move, precisely the kind of pressure release that Rachel favored, but of course it didn't go unnoticed. 3 days later, while Rachel was replacing a damaged sensor in the western pasture, her dogs began barking, short, aggressive bursts that told her they weren't warning off wildlife but reacting to something deliberate. She returned to the main house and checked the perimeter cameras. A silver Toyota had parked just beyond the north tree line, its occupants exiting with notepads, clipboards, and bright orange safety vests, uniforms of civilian contractors hired by municipalities for environmental assessment. Rachel zoomed in. She didn't recognize the faces. They weren't local. One of them began walking the fence line, peering through binoculars and taking notes. Another pulled out a digital meter and pointed it toward the bull's paddock. Rachel did not confront them. She did not step outside. Instead, she activated her secondary surveillance drone, which hovered silently above the property and recorded everything in high resolution. From the shadows of her porch, she watched as one of the men reached through the fence to collect a sample of the soil, his hand inches from the muzzle of one of her bulls, who snorted once and stood his ground. Rachel's jaw tightened. That was no environmental survey. That was evidence collection. Within the hour, her lawyer filed a second motion, this time for trespassing and unauthorized biological sampling on protected federal livestock territory. The agents retreated before dusk, but the message was clear. Someone had put money and resources into probing her defenses. Someone with the ability to mobilize civilian contractors. Someone who wasn't acting alone. And still, the pressure mounted. That weekend, during a routine inspection of the feed bins, Rachel discovered a thick reddish-brown residue coating the interior walls of one of the storage silos. She scraped it with a gloved hand and brought it inside, where a portable analysis kit confirmed what she already suspected. An industrial-strength herbicide, one used in commercial agriculture but banned in federal conservation zones due to its carcinogenic properties and potential for cross-contamination. Rachel sealed the sample in a sterile container and logged the evidence with date, time, and GPS coordinates. She uploaded the incident report directly to the Department of Agricultural Security and followed it with a secondary notification to the Wildlife and Livestock Preservation Division. The response was swift. Within 48 hours, a field agent arrived under full federal authority, conducted a sweep of the storage area, and opened a formal investigation. They interviewed Rachel, examined her logs, and pulled samples from her water lines, feedstock, and pasture grass. The agent, a tall, weathered man with a calm voice and scarred knuckles, spoke little, but his eyes told Rachel that he understood exactly what was happening. Before leaving, he handed her a business card with a handwritten number on the back. "If they try anything else," he said, "call this one directly. He doesn't ask questions, he responds." The following night, Rachel was jolted awake by a high-pitched beeping from her east perimeter. The alarm system had been tripped. She dressed quickly, strapped her sidearm to her hip, and checked the surveillance feed. A motionless figure stood near the fence, cloaked in darkness, barely visible except for the faint gleam of a metallic object in their hand. Rachel adjusted the camera's contrast. Wire cutters. The figure clipped at the fence, testing the voltage, unaware of the low-frequency alarm pulsing silently beneath their feet. Rachel didn't call the police. Instead, she activated the security grid. The floodlights surged to life, illuminating the field in white brilliance. The figure stumbled back, shielding their eyes, then bolted toward the tree line. But they weren't fast enough. The dogs were already in motion. By the time Rachel reached the scene, the intruder had been cornered by her shepherds, who kept him pinned. Snarling, growling, disciplined not to attack, but to hold. He was young, maybe 19, no older, shaking, eyes wide. Not a threat on his own, but a pawn. He carried a folded map of her property and a printed set of coordinates. Rachel called the local authorities this time, not because she needed them, but because the arrest would need to be official. When the deputies arrived, they recognized him immediately. A troubled youth, frequent runaway, recently affiliated with a group of concerned citizens who had begun organizing under Karen's watchful eye. The boy said little, but the deputies said less. They glanced uneasily at Rachel, took the map and the cutters into evidence, and promised follow-up. She knew better than to expect it. That week, the local community board issued a public statement through their newsletter, stating that recent events had highlighted the need for clarity, cooperation, and accountability, and proposed a vote to reclassify livestock regulations within their jurisdiction. They claimed this was a response to resident unease and the unusual presence of armed federal agents within a peaceful community. Rachel read it once, then burned the flyer in her fire pit. The escalation was no longer a question of if, but when and how far. At night, Rachel began to sleep in shifts, 3 hours on, 3 hours off. She rotated surveillance patterns, adjusted lighting, placed decoys, and began archiving her footage to a private server routed through encrypted layers of defense. She didn't tell anyone what she was preparing for. She didn't need to. The land would speak for her if it came to that. And still, through it all, Karen remained silent. She hadn't shown her face in weeks. No more friendly notes, no sidewalk smiles, no new flyers on the gate. But Rachel felt her fingerprints on every move. On the contractors, on the boy with the wire cutters, on the quiet push behind policy changes no one had dared suggest until now. She was orchestrating this, not loudly, not overtly, but like a conductor behind the curtain, waiting for the final note. Rachel stood on her porch one evening, a wind howling through the trees like something half forgotten, and whispered to herself what she hadn't yet spoken aloud. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a siege. The truth revealed itself not through confrontation, but through the subtle tremors of bureaucratic pressure and procedural irregularities, which Rachel Sloan had learned to read like a second language after decades of navigating classified corridors, and offices where policy wasn't just written, it was weaponized. It began with a call from her attorney in Austin, his tone calm but edged with concern, informing her that 2 new complaints had been filed not with local authorities, but with a regional agricultural board known more for its political affiliations than its regulatory integrity. The complaints alleged that Rachel's bulls posed a biosecurity threat to neighboring livestock due to genetic instability, a term so specific and misapplied that Rachel immediately knew someone had access to files they weren't supposed to possess. Her bulls weren't just protected. They were registered under a Federal Preservation Act that classified their DNA sequence as a strategic agricultural asset. The only way someone could file a complaint at this level, using that language, was if they had gained access to privileged data, or had been coached by someone who had. This wasn't neighborly meddling anymore. It was tactical sabotage. Rachel didn't panic. She responded. Within 24 hours, she had compiled and submitted a comprehensive dossier to her contact at the Department of Agricultural Intelligence, a rarely mentioned but very real agency tasked with protecting biologically strategic resources across the country. The dossier included photographic evidence of the bull's conditions, veterinary certifications, detailed feed logs, and surveillance footage of the prior intrusions. In parallel, she contacted a journalist she trusted, an investigative reporter based in D.C., who owed her a favor from a case 10 years back that had never made the front page but had saved the man's career and possibly his life. Rachel didn't want press. She wanted leverage. A single paragraph about federal property being targeted by local sabotage, buried halfway into a Sunday column, would be enough to make certain people pause before digging further. The silence that followed was strategic. No inspections, no calls, just a long, still pause, exactly the kind that precedes a shift in strategy. Rachel used the time wisely. She restructured her surveillance system, integrating thermal mapping overlays and adding a low-profile satellite uplink that bounced her feeds through a remote outpost in Montana. She brought in a third-party environmental assessor, one not affiliated with the region, and paid them to conduct an official audit of her land, knowing the results would be immune to tampering and admissible in any courtroom that mattered. She wasn't waiting for another attack. She was laying the groundwork for counteraction. But the true turning point came not through any external event, but in the form of a meeting, a formal recorded session organized by the County Mediation Board at the request of the Concerned Residents Coalition, a term now openly used in emails, and documents to describe what was, in essence, a personality cult orbiting Karen Rawlings. Rachel received the invitation by certified mail, with a formal note indicating that her continued refusal to participate in community dialogues had created an atmosphere of division and hostility. She showed up alone, wearing black, her posture composed, carrying a single leather folder. The meeting took place in a windowless room at the County Services Center, where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and a cheap plastic table sat at the center like a stage set for polite conflict. On one side, Karen sat flanked by two of her committee allies, a retiree who once ran the HOA and a woman who sold essential oils at local fairs and had declared herself a community wellness liaison. Across from them, Rachel took her seat, quietly, observing, saying nothing. A moderator, a mid-level county official with a tie 2 sizes too large, began by reading a statement about neighborly engagement and shared spaces, then asked Karen to explain the purpose of the session. Karen's performance was calculated, almost rehearsed. She spoke in soft tones, expressing concern for safety, confusion over the bull's presence, alarm at the level of security Rachel maintained. She never accused directly, but her implications were sharpened like blades. Hints of illegal activities, of unregistered surveillance, of emotional distress caused to the peaceful families in the area. She referenced the young man caught trespassing, framing him as a misguided teenager traumatized by an overreaction. She even cited local children being too frightened to ride their bikes near Rachel's property due to the ominous fencing and aggressive signage. Rachel let her speak. When it was her turn, she opened the folder, removed a single sheet, and slid it across the table to the moderator. It was a copy of the federal designation of her property as a strategic preservation site, complete with signatures from 4 different agencies, a scanned copy of the bull's DNA certification, and a clause noting that interference with the operation of the site could be prosecuted under federal anti-sabotage statutes. The moderator read the page, paled slightly, and looked up at Karen without a word. Rachel then spoke, calm, measured, emotionless. She outlined the timeline of intrusions, presented photographic stills of the intruders, noted the illegality of the drone surveillance Karen had conducted, and referenced the ongoing federal investigation into the chemical sabotage of her livestock feed. She concluded not with a threat, but a statement. I have followed every local, state, and federal regulation applicable to my operation. I have documented every violation against me and submitted it to the relevant authorities. I do not wish to be here, but if required, I will pursue every legal and procedural avenue to protect this land and its designations. This is not a threat. It is a promise, grounded in precedent. The room fell silent. Karen's allies exchanged glances. Even the moderator appeared visibly shaken. Karen, for the first time, said nothing. She didn't argue. She didn't smile. She simply stared at Rachel with a look that wasn't anger, but recognition. She knew now what Rachel truly was. Not just a woman with privacy issues or federal connections, but a trained operator, someone who knew systems better than the people who thought they controlled them. The meeting ended without resolution, but Rachel didn't need one. She had shifted the balance. She didn't win, yet, but she changed the tone. From that moment on, Karen's efforts became more cautious, less overt. The committee emails slowed. The visits to her fence line stopped. The boy who'd trespassed was quietly sent to live with a cousin out of state. Rachel continued her routines, continued her surveillance, but she no longer felt like she was defending. She was waiting, watching, because people like Karen didn't stop. They adapted. The quiet after the mediation meeting was not peace. It was recalibration. Rachel Sloan had not expected Karen to disappear or surrender. Women like her didn't give up. They shifted tactics, reassessed, and came back harder, dressed in the language of rules, reform, and responsibility. That was what made them dangerous. Not their loud accusations or moral outrage, but the insidious way they could turn structure into a weapon. And Rachel knew that once her opponent had seen the boundaries of legal pressure, the next step would be psychological warfare, the kind that poisons from within, turning a community not just against a target, but against itself. It started with the letters. Rachel began receiving them not in envelopes but as folded flyers pinned to the gate by thumbtacks, each one written in the same font, the same passive-aggressive tone, always unsigned. They ranged from polite concern to veiled threats disguised as safety reminders. Please consider lowering your perimeter lighting. It affects neighboring wildlife habitats. It would mean a lot to the community if you participated in our seasonal cleanup initiative. Aggressive guard dogs may violate County Code 17.8c, please. Review your responsibilities as an animal owner. There were dozens of them, sometimes arriving twice in a day, always timed when Rachel was away on errands or tending to the bulls deep in the pasture. She installed another layer of motion-activated surveillance. This time, a facial recognition program linked to a private forensic database. The results came back with 3 consistent matches: Karen, the essential oils woman, and a young man who'd once been cited for property damage during a zoning protest. Rachel filed everything. Then came the public strategy. Karen leveraged her influence to launch what she called the Reclamation Initiative, a community-driven push to restore cohesion and clarity to their neighborhood. She created a website filled with vague mission statements about accountability, transparency, and safety. It featured stock photos of smiling families, children playing on green lawns, and banners reading, "Take back our peace." But beneath the surface was a series of maps, digital overlays showing zoning suggestions, proposed walking paths, communal, farming space, all of which conveniently involved slicing off portions of Rachel's property under the guise of shared use enhancements. It was absurd, completely unenforceable, but it wasn't designed to win in court. It was meant to reframe the conversation, to imply that Rachel was the intruder, the disruption, the outsider preventing progress. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began speaking up, not out of belief, but out of pressure. Rachel noted the subtle changes: deliveries that arrived late or damaged, repairmen who canceled last minute, supplies that went missing en route. When she questioned the feed distributor about an overdue order, the woman on the phone lowered her voice and said, "I was told not to service your address anymore." Said there were legal complications. Rachel thanked her, documented the call, and filed a complaint with the Department of Agricultural Equity Enforcement. 2 days later, a different supplier began delivering to her directly from another county. It wasn't efficient, but it was a temporary solution. The true breaking point came not with a drone or a letter or a fence breach, but with silence from her bulls. One morning, Rachel walked to the eastern paddock for the regular health inspection and found the animals clustered tightly, unusually still. One was lying down, not dead, but unmoving, its breath shallow and erratic. The others stood around it protectively, emitting low warning sounds when she approached. Rachel didn't hesitate. She triggered the emergency veterinary protocol, administered a base stimulant, and ran a blood panel through the portable lab housed in her basement. The results came back within 15 minutes. Traces of a compound she recognized immediately: alkaloid-based sedative, agricultural grade, used in rural poaching operations across several states, banned federally due to its effects on muscular degeneration in certain species. Someone had dosed her livestock. She checked the fence, no breaks. She checked the cameras, no obvious movement. But when she examined the water filtration valve, she saw the residue. Someone had tampered with the system, introducing the agent through a manual override installed weeks earlier during a routine equipment upgrade. Rachel hadn't been watching then. She had trusted the technicians. That was her mistake. The sedated bull survived, but the damage was permanent. One leg showed signs of motor impairment, and though it could walk, it would never be viable for the breeding program again. Rachel reported the incident to the agency, sent a detailed report to her attorney, and filed a federal sabotage claim. That night, for the first time, she sat at the kitchen table staring at the list of steps she had taken, the growing file of evidence, the names, the footage, the legal records, and she realized that what had begun as harassment had matured into a sustained, organized campaign designed not to pressure her into compliance, but to wear her down until she left voluntarily or was legally removed. And Rachel had no intention of leaving. The next morning, she took the offensive. She called in a professional investigator, retired FBI, working freelance now. The man arrived without luggage, carrying only a reinforced laptop case and wearing a jacket that bore no insignia. He didn't ask questions. Rachel handed him a drive with over 1,000 hours of footage, logs, timestamps, and names. He reviewed it silently, nodded once, and said, "I'll find out how deep this goes. No paper trail. No footprint." Within 5 days, the investigator returned with a report that confirmed what Rachel already suspected but hadn't fully proven. Karen's husband, a former zoning board advisor, had retained quiet ownership of 2 shell companies registered in Arizona and Nevada. These entities were listed as silent partners in several rural real estate investment initiatives, including one targeting federal conservation land for redevelopment. Through backdoor political support and local proxies, they had been targeting landowners who operated on the fringes of standard zoning protections. Rachel's bulls and her property weren't just annoying. They were a financial roadblock, a risk. The sabotage wasn't personal, it was business. The initiative Karen had launched publicly had been funded through one of those shell companies. The boy with the cutters? His uncle was a contractor for Karen's husband's firm. The poisoning incident? The filtration system installer had links to a private group known for undermining rural conservation projects in favor of agricultural repurposing. Rachel didn't smile when she read the report. She didn't speak. She simply stood up, walked to the garage, and opened the steel cabinet she hadn't touched since retirement. Inside was a locked case, coated in dust and regulation seals. She opened it slowly, revealing a single folder labeled CIV 94A, Authority Under Crisis Protocol, Category D. It was outdated, but the legal precedents it contained were not. She made 4 phone calls, 3 to people still active in government, 1 to a journalist who'd been sitting on a story about land repurposing schemes tied to corporate lobbying groups. And then she waited. 2 days later, the silence shattered. Federal agents arrived at the development's civic hall, served a warrant for financial documents tied to Karen's community initiative, and seized 3 public computers. Karen wasn't arrested yet, but she was named in a formal federal investigation tied to illegal land acquisition, sabotage of protected livestock operations, and conspiracy to circumvent zoning restrictions through fraudulent community proposals. Rachel was never mentioned by name, but everyone knew. That night, someone fired a single shot at her fence line. It missed. It wasn't meant to hit. It was a warning. Rachel responded by installing additional cameras. Thermal, layered with motion triggers, powered independently. She reinforced the pasture gates and rotated the bulls back into the main paddock for better surveillance. She took the casing from the shot, had it analyzed, traced the make and model of the rifle, and logged it in the ongoing investigation. She did not call the sheriff. The community began to fracture. Some neighbors sent quiet messages of apology. Others moved away without explanation. The board meetings stopped. The flyers disappeared. And Karen? She vanished. Her home remained lit. Her car still parked in the driveway, but she was no longer seen in public. Her husband resigned from the investment group. Her website went offline. But Rachel didn't relax, because this was the part of the fight most people never understood. It wasn't over when the headlines stopped. It was over when the silence no longer felt like a pause before another strike. And that moment had not yet come. The air had shifted again, and Rachel Sloane felt it before she could define it. An unsettling stillness not born from peace but from retreat, as if her adversaries had exhausted one avenue of attack and were now reloading behind thicker walls. Karen's house stood quiet, her car unmoved for days, yet lights flickered on at irregular hours and deliveries arrived in unmarked vehicles, not through the main gate but from the service road behind the fence line, a path most neighbors didn't even realize existed. It wasn't over, not yet. There was a weight in the silence now, something that pressed on the atmosphere like the air before a storm, and Rachel, who had lived through too many operational standoffs and manufactured ceasefires, recognized the pattern. This was the part where desperation replaced strategy, where someone who had already lost control started making irreversible mistakes. Oh. It came without fanfare on a humid Thursday morning when Rachel returned from the supply depot to find a police cruiser idling at the edge of her property. She parked without haste, stepped out calmly, and approached. The officer, a uniformed woman she hadn't seen before, maybe transferred in recently, met her at the gate with a clipboard and a clipped tone. There had been a formal complaint filed against Rachel, she said, involving allegations of environmental negligence, misuse of federal resources, and potential violations of regional noise ordinances. The officer spoke as if reading from a script, her gaze flicking only briefly toward the house, never making direct eye contact. Rachel didn't interrupt. She let the officer finish, then quietly requested a copy of the complaint, reviewed the signatures, and noted the one she recognized immediately. Karen Rawlings, appended to a new title. Acting Environmental Risk Advisor for the Reclamation Initiative. So that was the play now. Karen had shifted her status from accuser to expert, cloaking herself in manufactured authority and attempting to weaponize the very systems Rachel had once mastered. It was a bold move, one that required coordination and desperation in equal measure, because now Karen was no longer trying to pressure Rachel into leaving. She was attempting to build a case that would remove her by force, legally, surgically, under the guise of public safety. Rachel thanked the officer, who seemed relieved not to be challenged, and watched the cruiser disappear down the long gravel path, its tires leaving fresh impressions in the red dust. Then she returned to the house and began the final preparation. She contacted her attorney first, forwarded the documents, and instructed him to pre-file a motion of judicial review tied to procedural misconduct. She cross-referenced the complaint with federal jurisdiction maps and confirmed, once again, that her property fell outside the authority of regional zoning boards due to its preservation designation. She notified the Department of Agricultural Security of the new challenge, attached a log of Karen's title changes, and then, for the first time in months, made a direct call to Washington. The man who answered hadn't heard from Rachel in years, but his tone shifted the moment he recognized her voice. She laid out the situation, concise and cold, and requested an on-site federal audit, not of her property, but of the administrative channels being used against her. The man didn't ask why. He simply said, "You'll have them by Monday." But Karen wasn't waiting for Monday. The following evening, Rachel's motion sensors detected movement near the southern fencing. 3 heat signatures, low to the ground, moving slowly, deliberately. She activated her secondary drone, circled overhead, and identified the figures as human, dressed in dark clothing, 2 with backpacks, 1 with a large rectangular object wrapped in canvas. She enhanced the feed: bolt cutters, a container, and what appeared to be a field-grade water contaminant unit. Not amateurs, trained, possibly hired, and operating under the illusion that Rachel was still reacting, still defending. She wasn't. She'd been preparing for this. The moment they breached the fence, silent alarms triggered a sequence that cut exterior lighting for 30 seconds, forcing them into darkness, and into her line of sight. From the tree line, Rachel watched through a thermal scope, tracking their movements, logging every step. She didn't fire. She didn't move. She simply recorded. When they reached the first livestock trough and began tampering with the filtration box, she activated the alert protocol. It took less than 5 minutes. A black SUV rolled up the access road, lights off, federal tags hidden behind dust shields. 4 agents exited, weapons drawn but not raised. They didn't need to shout. The men on the property dropped their tools and ran, but not far. Infrared perimeter nets triggered just beyond the first clearing, launching low-voltage disorientation pulses designed for containment, not injury. By the time the agents reached them, all 3 were face down, restrained, and silent. No questions. No resistance. One of the agents approached Rachel at the fence line, offered her a tablet displaying a live copy of the footage, and said only, "This is enough." By sunrise, the men were in federal custody, and Rachel's property was classified as an active federal protection site under subsection 9, meaning any further unauthorized contact could now be prosecuted as an attempt to compromise national agricultural resources. The escalation had triggered a procedural firewall, one that Karen and her shadow operations couldn't bypass without federal clearance, which she did not and would never have. And then the knock came. 2 days later, Rachel was notified that Karen had been served with a formal subpoena to appear in federal court. The charges weren't public yet, but the language was damning. Conspiracy to undermine federal property, unauthorized use of false credentials in a zoning complaint, coordination of property-based sabotage. The final charge, however, was the one that mattered: attempting to access, alter, or destroy livestock deemed critical to national biosecurity efforts. That one carried weight, and it didn't go away with a fine or a settlement. It required trial, and trials demanded evidence. Rachel had that in abundance. Still, she didn't attend the hearing. She didn't need to. The department would handle the rest. What she did do was walk the perimeter one last time, checking every gate, every sensor, every wire. Her bulls grazed quietly behind reinforced fencing, oblivious to the war that had almost cost them their protection. The land was still, her house intact, her systems untouched. The real victory wasn't that Karen was facing trial, it was that Rachel no longer needed to defend herself, because from that point forward the law, the very structure Karen had tried to bend, now stood between her and Rachel, and for someone like Karen, that was the most humiliating defeat imaginable. She hadn't just lost, she'd exposed herself. And Rachel? She simply returned to the silence. In the weeks that followed the arrests and the federal filings, the Valley began to breathe differently. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't dramatic. No announcements were made, no headlines ran across the local news, no apologies arrived in the envelopes, but something fundamental had shifted. The tension that had once hung like static between fences and front porches began to dissolve into something closer to awareness, if not understanding. Oh. Rachel Sloane became an accepted anomaly, no longer a curiosity or a threat, but something fixed, unchangeable and immovable in a way that left no room for argument. Neighbors who once avoided her gaze now nodded from the safety of their porches. Some offered small gestures of uneasy goodwill. A dozen eggs in a brown carton left at the gate, a handwritten note folded neatly between delivery invoices, even a single flower clipped from someone's garden and set carefully on her mailbox. Rachel did not reciprocate, but she also did not rebuke them. She accepted the gestures in silence, not because she needed peace with them, but because she knew they needed closure more than she did. Karen's house went dark. The windows remained shuttered. Her car disappeared one night and never returned. There was no for sale sign, no moving truck, only the quiet exodus of a woman who had spent months trying to reshape the world around her and had found herself caught in the trap she'd set for someone else. Rumors spread. She was facing federal trial, she had moved in with family, she was under some kind of watch, but Rachel never inquired. Her name appeared briefly in a federal bulletin marked for internal use only, next to a line of formal charges and a status designation that read, "Pending judicial action. High-profile asset interference. Security flag active." That was the last Rachel saw of her. The land healed. The bulls, even the one injured, adapted to a new routine. Their movement slower but steady. Their temperament unchanged. Rachel restructured the paddocks, upgraded the filtration systems one final time, and added biometric access to the main gate. Not because she feared more intrusions, but because she had learned that even silence could be temporary, and she preferred preparation over reaction. She no longer wore her sidearm daily, but it remained within reach, and the dogs, older now, more aware, kept their own watch. Some nights, Rachel sat on the porch with a mug of coffee grown cold in her hands, her eyes on the horizon where the hills dipped into the edge of distant light. And she thought not of victory, but of maintenance, of endurance, of the strange weight, of peace when it had to be earned inch by inch through conflict that never should have existed in the first place. A letter came one day, official, sealed with the emblem of the Department of Agricultural Preservation. It confirmed the permanent classification of her property under Tier 1 federal preservation protections. It meant she could not be evicted, rezoned, harassed through local legislation, or targeted by state-level complaints. Her land was no longer simply private. It was sovereign in a way that few outside the system understood, and fewer still could ever undo. She filed the document with the others, locked it in the cabinet, and exhaled slowly for the first time in months. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't celebrate. She simply turned off the kitchen light, stepped outside, and stood beneath the open sky. Alone, unbothered, and exactly where she intended to remain. There were no more drones, no more flyers, no more boys with bolt cutters or empty threats wrapped in suburban politeness. The quiet had returned not because her enemies had surrendered, but because they had been disarmed, by law, by exposure, by the truth of their own desperation. Rachel had not fought for recognition or control or validation. She had fought because the land demanded guardianship, because silence in the face of pressure became complicity, and because some fights, even when fought alone, carried weight beyond the individual. The ranch was still. The wind moved through the tall grass like a slow breath. Somewhere in the distance, the bulls stirred, snorting softly as they moved beneath the moonlight. Rachel turned back to the house, opened the door, and let it close behind her, not to keep the world out, but to remind herself that this was her space, hers to protect, not through force but through vigilance, integrity, and the understanding that Even in the most ordinary places, some wars are fought quietly and won absolutely.